Hello everyone, welcome to Anthropology 101. For today you should have read the first chapter from Disposition and the Environment, written by Paige West. I know that some of it's dense, but hopefully you were able to get through it. And what she does is, if you read the ethnographic descriptions, the story she tells about specific peoples, that can really help illuminate a lot of the more complex theoretical discussions. But ultimately, I'm interested in for the sake of this class, we don't necessarily need to go super deeply into all of this theoretical stuff. So my aim is going to be to talk about the kinds of core ideas of the book, simplify it a little bit, express these complex ideas in a bit simpler language, and then to also set forth my expectations for the book and how y'all should what y'all should be getting out of it. So this is our first book-length ethnography, and I included it in this class because it is a book-length ethnography that we can read. Great. So these are the objectives for what I want to accomplish through this lecture. I want to unpack and explain the basic argument of Paige West's book. A lot of it gets very complex, but I want you to have an understanding of the core assertion, which actually can be explained in much simpler language. And then we're going to spend a lot of time deconstructing this category or this concept of the primitive as actually a colonial cultural framework, as a colonial ideology that legitimizes global inequalities and systems of violence. And then I'm going to introduce this body of theory called from the 19th century called social evolutionism. And this is going to be a kind of example of the colonial ideologies that we're trying to critique here. And one of the key interventions, right, is that anthropology in the US as a discipline forms as in critique of these earlier ideas of social evolutionism, right? When we talk about Franz Boas earlier, we're talking about a critique of these ideas that have generated what we could call the contemporary study of culture. And so how is Paige West grappling with these kinds of broader histories and global power dynamics in her book? And how does she seek to represent Papua New Guineans in a way that critiques and seeks to transform these historical systems? So last class, we spent a lot of time talking about racism, and social inequality. We talked a lot about the ways that race and even whiteness are cultural constructs, but they're cultural constructs that organize our everyday lives in very intimate ways. And this is something that is going to tie actually pretty well into this book in a very neat way, right? And I think of a quote from Elridge Cleaver, who was a Black Panther, an ex-Black Panther. And one of his ideas from his writings is that colonialism abroad is enforced by the military, while colonialism at home is enforced by the police. So what we can see in the US as a kind of regime of police violence, we can also look at abroad and ask, how is colonial violence enacted in other parts of the world? And how do we understand this kinds of connection between cultural constructs and ideologies on the one hand, and violence, everyday violence, as well as I guess the opposite of everyday violence, more like the kinds of violence that's not everyday but that often gets put in the news. And so these are the kinds of core questions that we're going to be approaching through this book. So I wanted to locate Papua New Guinea on a map. Sometimes you'll hear me calling it Papua New Guinea, other times PNG. I wanted to give you a sense of where it is on a map, as well as a picture of a place within Papua New Guinea. But keep in mind, as Paige West tells us, Papua New Guinea is actually one of the most environmentally and sociolinguistically diverse regions in the world. There are just an astronomical number of different species, as well as languages that are spoken in a relatively small space. So when we talk about Papua New Guinea, we're not talking about any one thing, right? We're talking about many different peoples. She says over 850 languages. So again, the book can get into some very complex theoretical issues. And to kind of keep everyone from getting overwhelmed, I just want to unpack why did I assign this book and what am I hoping that y'all will get out of this book. So again, this is a book-length ethnography, and I wanted to give you examples of what ethnographies were, how anthropologists write, in the kind of sense of creating these books about culture. It's also a really lovely example of anthropological holism, because it's very much interested in the relationship between symbols and representations, how people represent, how the people in the U.S. represent Papua New Guinea, and how those representations are related to cultural institutions, practices, and violence like dispossession. She's also going to introduce this new theme, right? This is a big theme that I'm going to be talking about a lot today, which is problematizing this idea of the primitive, and how do we understand this idea of the primitive as actually a specifically colonial ideology. Paige West also foregrounds global connections, right? So she's not interested in Papua New Guinea or Papua New Guineans as kind of representing a self-contained or isolated culture that can be compared and maybe is different in certain ways. She's rather interested in how do people make life within these complex systems of global interconnection and movement, in which people are talking and interacting with one another across vast reaches of space. This is a theme that we're going to really start getting into in the next couple weeks as well, breaking apart this idea that we can talk about cultures as self-contained, bounded units, and instead thinking about global systems of interconnection. And then the last theme is to pay attention to is, so how does Paige West grapple with colonial legacies in anthropology? How does she articulate the history of colonialism in anthropology? And how does she think we can move forward and do something that's better, that addresses these problems? So if you get lost with all the abstract theory, come back to these kinds of core themes, right, that I'm coming to. And again, the point of today is really to problematize these colonial ideologies of the primitive. So again, if you're lost by these theoretical portions, keep your focus on the ethnographic descriptions and stories, because these actually really illustrate her arguments in a powerful way. And so even if the theoretical conversations where she's talking about Marx and Althusser might lose you, though it's often easier to follow the ethnographic stories, the descriptions of actual people's lives. And another thing to keep in mind is that this isn't just an ethnography about Papua New Guinea. It's an ethnography of colonial ideologies, especially in the U.S., about Papua New Guinea peoples. So it's as much about the U.S. as it is about PNG. It's as much about colonial countries as it is about PNG. So one of the things you should be doing when you're reading for this class, or really any anthropology course, or really any social science or science course, and probably most humanities courses, is pay attention, try and identify what is the thesis of each reading. Where do they articulate what the basic argument of the text is? And Paige West does this in two different points. She does it on page 1 and again on page 23. I've pulled these quotes out for you, but keep that in mind for everything that we're reading. When you see that kind of statement where the author says, this is what my argument is, underline it, star it, make sure you know that information. That's super helpful, right? Because when we're reading things, there's a certain way social scientists tend to organize their writing. And if you know how it's organized, you can actually read through it faster and easier. There's the thesis, which explains what the main point is. Then there are supporting chunks. There are concepts and supporting bits. Each section, make a note of what, for example, there's like a bold text within different sections. That text will give you a different idea. It'll give you an idea of what that portion is of the reading is about. And that will be organized. So each portion, right, each subsection is organized according to a coherent idea. So can you identify what that idea is? Can you basically create an outline of the chapter, a reverse outline of the chapter? And some of the components, some of the anthropologists in their writing, some of these sections will be about theoretical concepts. Some of it will be descriptions, ethnographic descriptions, right? And as long as you can kind of categorize what you're reading, that does help you read it through it faster and more simpler. Because even if you get bogged down by a really dense section, you can still step back and say, okay, but here's the basic idea, even if I don't get all of it. Here's the basic idea, and here's how it fits into the main argument and the chapter as a whole. Okay, so we have the thesis. But the thesis in this case was it's still a little dense, yeah? A little unclear for maybe a lot of folks in this class who are not trained anthropologists who've been reading this stuff for 20 years. So what does that mean, right, in more simple language? Essentially, what Paige West is interested in getting at is how do representations of Papua New Guinea inform global political and economic processes? So what's the relationship between representations, cultural symbols, and then political and economic processes like dispossession and poverty and underdevelopment? So what's the relationship between these symbolic systems and material violence? And she often talks about the former using this phrase of representational strategies or rhetorics. Essentially what she's getting at are what are the kinds of patterns or conventions around how Papua New Guinea is represented within other countries, within the US and Europe. So we can then break this kind of broader argument down into its core pillars. And there are really these two pillars of Paige West's book. The first one is representations, and the second one is global economic processes, capitalism, and dispossession. And so this issue of representations is really the first question that structures this book, which is how is Papua New Guinea and Papua New Guinean people, how are they represented within the centers of colonial power, places like New York or London? And she's interested in how she's interested in these systems of representations as a cultural system, as a colonial cultural system, or at least the legacy of a colonial cultural system that normalizes and justifies specific relationships and specific ideas about what Papua New Guinea is and the kind of people who live there. And so this is really what she talks about in terms of this concept of the other. The idea, right, is that Papua New Guineans are imagined as the antithesis of the US. So, for example, folks in New York are imagining not only what is Papua New Guinea, but by extension, who are they? What is it to be American? What's their place in the world by virtue of contrast with Papua New Guinean peoples? And so Paige West gives us these three vignettes that really illustrate what she's talking about here. She talks about having lunch with the prime minister and an economicist within her group. Instead of talking about his own research, as he's asked by the prime minister asks him, he shifts the conversation to talk about cannibalism, and he just wants to talk about cannibalism. And he keeps talking about these ideas about the remoteness of Papua New Guinea, about the impenetrable jungles, about cannibalism, really framing Papua New Guinea as this very exotic, faraway place, full of primitive customs. In the second story, she talks about her own friend in Papua New Guinea who loves spinning yarns to tourists about how he is a cannibal. And he spins these very elaborate stories and really enjoys doing this, kind of just fucking with tourists by playing into these stereotypes. And the third story is about a journalist who characterized Papua New Guinea as a foil for New York City. So she talks about New York as this creative center, as this metropolis of creativity where there's all of these infrastructures and resources for our emerging artists, and it really attracts this kind of artistic community. And she says, the journalist says, because if it weren't for all that infrastructure, these artists could have gone anywhere. They could have gone to Papua New Guinea. So in this, right, Papua New Guinea becomes a stand-in for everything that's not metropolitan, for everything that's not, that departs from these kinds of bourgeois values, everything that's not the U.S. She talks about it as a place, like in other works, she talks about it as a place where people might go to, where U.S. folks might go doing work in Peace Corps, right? So she's framing it as a kind of failed state, as a place that is in need of aid. And the idea in all of these representations, again, is this idea that Papua New Guinea is the other. It is the foil, the opposition to everything that is New York City, that is bourgeois culture, that is civilized or advanced societies. It's isolated, not metropolitan. It's remote. It's exotic. It's impenetrable. And one of the things Paige West observes is that within this kind of system of representations, we see these two connected ideas, the primitive and the jungle, right? And we can think of this like you can think of the Jungle Book as a similar kind of representation, right? How are people, how is the jungle represented? What kind of place is it? What kind of people live there and what are they like? And so we have this whole symbolic framework, right, in which you're supposed to have primitive folks who live closer to nature in these isolated landscapes like the jungle. And we see this whole geography of colonial ideologies, this whole understanding of space, of different places and the kinds of people who live in there, that really creates this hierarchy between people who are more primitive and people who are more advanced, or at least seen that way. And so this is an important piece, right, of the book, right, is like this isn't the reality of Papua New Guinea. This is just how Papua New Guinea is perceived and represented within places like the United States. And we need to break these things apart, right, or tease these differences apart, because in the one sense, these representations are cultural fictions in that they're not actually based on Papua New Guineans' lives. They're stereotypes, but they're also stereotypes that inform policy in very concrete ways. They have material effects. They inform global economic processes. They legitimize processes like dispossession, which takes me to the next core pillar of Paige West's book. The second pillar of this book then is dispossession. How do those representations then shape and inform economic practices like dispossession that are really at the heart of global capitalist processes? And one of the things that West really notes in the book is that there's historically a debate between, on the one hand, folks who say, where does wealth come from? Well, it comes from elites who are industrious, who are frugal, who use their resources well in order to generate wealth through their own good moral nature. And then there's another camp, right, that says that's not it at all. The way in which people accumulate wealth is by extracting resources from colonized environments, from working class people in factories, and it's by extracting that wealth they're able to accumulate vast quantities of wealth. And Paige West really falls into that latter camp, right? She's interested in saying, how is global wealth produced by how is global wealth produced by these global systems of dispossession? And what does that dispossession look like in Papua New Guinea? So again, the big picture here is how do these representations of Papua New Guinea influence these global processes of extracting wealth and dispossession? How do they shape these global forms and flows that we now would understand as capitalism, for example? So we're connecting the local Papua New Guinea to the global. Now, when she talks about capitalism, one of the kinds of key points she makes is we can't understand Papua New Guinea without understanding both capitalism and imperialism. And we have to understand how these two things are related. And her main point about capitalism, right, is that it's premised upon the enclosure of land. Because when you enclose land, you transform people into wage laborers. I'm going to come back to that. And you need those wage laborers to work in factories. But then there's also this second component, which is imperialism, which is that in order for capitalism to expand and for capitalists to increase their wealth, they need to expand their markets. Capitalism has to always be growing. And so you do that through these imperialistic policies in which you basically you colonize these other areas in order to expand your pool of laborers, to expand your pool of consumers, and to extract raw materials, right? That you then can use to create commodities in factories to create profit. And if you look at history, the historical process, this is how capitalism and imperialism have taken shape, right? Is through this kind of profit motive in part. Part of this effort to expand markets, to claim more raw materials, to colonize people and transform them into a growing body of laborers. Okay, so the last two slides were about getting a sense of the kinds of pillars of her main argument. And in these next two slides, I'm going to talk about a few more definitions that she offers that I think are really important. And the most important one is this concept of ideology. That's a word that I've thrown out a few times by now. And she has a definition on page 5, right? If you go to page 5 in the book, it is it starts on the first sentence of the second full paragraph. What I mean by ideology is a set of both conscious and unconscious ideas that are meant to be normative, that have an internal logic and a particular historical genealogy, that are meant to persuade, that are meant to guide people's actions and help them see and understand the world, and that serve as a logic and a means by which people justify their actions. And she goes on to continue this definition in a few more lines. So again, that's kind of complicated, but basically what she's saying is that ideology is basically cultural or symbolic systems that are inflected with power. They are conscious and unconscious ideas, and they justify or legitimize our actions or social orders. So for an example, an ideology may naturalize social inequalities. It may make them appear natural or normal. For example, a common ideology in the US is that we live in a meritocratic society and everyone has an equal shot. That ideology justifies a particular status quo. But what it obscures is, for example, systems like race and racism, systems of real inequalities. We could also look at, again, the vignette told by one of Paige West's, told in one of her stories in the beginning, where you have this journalist talking about how, creatives are drawn to places like New York because there's just this great cultural infrastructure and it's very technologically advanced and whatnot. And if it weren't for that, they could be anywhere, right? They could be in Papua New Guinea. And the way she talks about Papua New Guinea, again, frames it as the kind of foil for everything that's good about the US, right? Everything that's good about capitalism. And she frames Papua New Guinea as this place that's untouched by these great processes of capital. And so then the question is, what is obscured by these ideologies? What kinds of power relations or social orders does that kind of statement justify or legitimize or naturalize? And what does it obscure? On the other hand, ideologies may also challenge social inequalities. They can advance an alternative vision of the world. For example, you might have a socialist ideology that challenges this idea that capitalism is inherently good. Or maybe your ideology is influenced by the Black Panthers, and that gives you a very different perspective on what is good and normal and the kinds of world we should be working towards. These are a few other concepts that keep coming up throughout the book. I just wanted to pull out a definition because I think Paige West is going to keep using them. These are not things I'm as concerned about you knowing, but as you should be able to recognize what she's talking about when she uses this language. Okay, so we can kind of look back at the big thesis of the book, which is, we can rephrase that as saying, Papua New Guinean people are represented as being primitives, as being the foil of civilization, of metropolitan places like New York. And that these representations are part of a broader colonial ideology, part of a broader imperialistic ideology that justify and legitimize particular kinds of economic and political relationships like dispossession. And so she talks about, so I wanted to give an example of where do these ideologies come from, right? And she talks about this a little towards the end. She mentions this idea of social evolutionism, which is a theoretical idea that emerges in academic circles in the 19th century. And this is really the root, maybe not the root, but this is an articulation of these broader imperialistic ideologies. And I will say, although it is a theoretical framework from the 19th century, you will very much see it permeating all of pop culture, right? It's a very common set of pop cultural assumptions and ideas to this day within the United States. So what is social evolutionism? Basically, it's this idea that every society evolves through linear stages of human progress, starting from the most primitive to those that are the most civilized. And the idea is that every society goes through this same history in these same stages. So sometimes you hear it called linear or unilinear social evolutionism, that there's one linear evolutionary process. And so in the 1800s, right, you can imagine, I often ask, what was the world like? What kinds of ideas could have influenced different scholars in this period? And of course, one of the kinds of big things is colonialism, right, which has this double effect. On the one hand, Europeans starting in the 1600s onward are starting to realize there's a lot of different kinds of people in the world, and they live in very different ways. And how do we make sense of these differences? How do we organize these differences? And the other piece was colonialism, right? And these emerging systems that held Europe to be the kind of center of the world. And these emerging relationships, these power inequalities of dispossession, as we're talking about. And so social evolutionism is a kind of answer to these questions, right? And it basically says, and so basically scholars read travel accounts written by Europeans who have visited different places across the world, and they try and say, okay, can we categorize the different societies from these accounts into this universal framework of linear progress from the most primitive to the most civilized. And part of the idea here was that in studying so-called primitive peoples, European scholars would have a glimpse into human prehistory. Basically, primitive peoples were living as European ancestors had lived hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so we would be getting this glimpse into Stone Age life, for example. We'd get this kind of understanding of European prehistory. And so different scholars created a number of different schemas or frameworks for understanding this kind of process of what they assumed to be social evolution. But Papua New Guinea is almost always placed at the very bottom, at the most primitive, while Europe is almost always placed at the top. I'm sorry, it always is placed at the top every single time. And so, I have here in this example, in this diagram, right, this is actually a scientific schema from the 1800s created by one scholar in particular, Lewis Henry Morgan. And he theorized that different societies could be organized into three basic stages of civilization or social process. At the bottom were savages, in the middle were barbarians, and at the top were civilized people. Now, I cannot underscore this enough. These are scientific categories of the time, right? These were the scientific categories. And the idea was that you would study, you could place different societies in different categories by looking at things like their material culture, for example, whether they had pottery or not, whether they used stone tools or metal tools, whether they had agriculture or were foraging peoples, whether they recognized multiple marriages, polyandry or blinking on the other one right now, so excuse me, or whether what was considered incest and what wasn't, and kind of shifts in ideas over what was considered incest or not. And all of this kind of complex constellation of different things could then be used to organize every society across the world in this universal scale of evolution. And the idea being that some people had gotten stuck part of the way, and that's why they were more primitive. For example, Asian nations, Asian states are often described within these literatures as being, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, not quite backwards, but like static. The idea being they had managed to progress quite a bit, but then ultimately fell into this kind of backwater and stopped progressing, unlike Europe, which becomes the kind of center of civilizational advancement. And so we can look at these, right? And of course, this is a colonial ideology, and yet it is very much a accepted as science, as scientific, the height of science in the 19th century. And different scholars come up with different frameworks. They might use different terms for these different stages, but there's usually three. An exception would be a more modern one, a more well, that's actually another one, primitive versus modern. But another contemporary one would be, for example, underdeveloped and developed, or fourth world, third world, second world, first world, global north, global south, etc. And so in contrast to this kind of framework, one of the things that Paige West seeks to do is to talk about Papua New Guinea not in this kind of evolutionary hierarchy, but rather how is life in Papua New Guinea and how representations of Papua New Guinea shaped and structured by these global capitalist and imperialistic processes. How do we understand Papua New Guinea as not just part of the broader contemporary world, but actually as a place that has played a major role in articulating what we mean by the modern world, even if it's through this kind of construction, this Eurocentric construction of Papua New Guinea as the other. So when we talk about social evolutionism as an academic framework, it really falls out of favor in the 1800s. And there's been a few revitalization efforts to revitalize it, but none of them have really taken hold. Well, that's not true, because there's also evolutionary psychology, which is basically the same theory articulated again. But by the early 1900s, these ideas were widely critiqued in academia, right? And we talked about Franz Boas in an earlier class, and one of his big interventions was he laid out a critique of this framework and really demonstrated that these were just not scientific frameworks in any shape or form. And he points out, right, they obscure local histories because we are framing every society as part of this universal history. We don't actually see the local historical processes, right? Instead, what we're doing is we're creating a just so story. We're creating a kind of like hypothetical, totally a hypothetical scenario or story that's totally ungrounded in any level of factual analysis, because it's basically just the observer, the scholar's own concepts of what is more civilized or more primitive. But there's no, it obscures what we could think of as the more empirical or the more concrete or like real study of actual people's histories, right? Which don't necessarily follow this universal linear logic. It also obscures global interconnections, right? If we're thinking about Papua New Guinea people as our ancestors today are, meaning white folks, what we lose sight of is that Papua New Guinean folks are contemporaries, and they are acting within the same globalized world as folks in New York, just in from a very different position within that globalized system of social inequalities. I mentioned that these categorizations are highly unscientific. They were a just so story that reflected the researcher's own kind of personal ideas. But they also recast these colonial ideologies in the language of science, right? They cast this kind of ideology that served to normalize and naturalize colonial violence, right? This idea that Europe had should be invading all these other countries, right? Because they were more advanced, they would be bringing civilization to these other societies, right? It takes these colonial ideologies and puts them into this language of scientific discourse, scientific analysis. And yet, even while we can say these ideas had been taken apart and dismantled and critiqued by 1901, by really 1898, these frameworks still influence popular culture profoundly to this day, right? We can think of basically any example of science fiction. Star Trek, right, and the Prime Directive, this idea of that it would be good to not meddle in the affairs of more primitive species, more primitive planets. We can look at ideas about development and global aid that organize the world according to this hierarchy of developed versus undeveloped, right? With the idea being that somehow these developed societies just naturally progressed further than these other ones. Subtext here, right, is that Paige West's argument is that's not how it happens. Developed countries develop themselves by dispossessing resources from other countries. They develop by undeveloping colonized nations, by extracting resources, by enslaving people and engaging in highly exploitative forms of wage labor. So even though these are profoundly unscientific ideas, they still are so powerful in pop culture today. And to kind of wrap all of these ideas from this whole lecture together, I want to focus on a question that a Papua New Guinean politician, Yali, asked to a author, Jared Diamond, I think American author. Jared Diamond's known for writing the book Guns, Germs, and Steel. And in this book, right, he talks about this question that Yali posed to him that really shapes the book itself, right? And Yali asks, why is it that you white people developed so much cargo? By cargo, he means material goods, stuff, but that we black people had so little cargo of our own. And Jared Diamond thinks about this question and basically writes the whole book Guns, Germs, and Steel as a response, as an answer to this question that Yali poses to him. Now, the thing is, and if you haven't read Jared Diamond's book, his answer is basically that there were certain environmental differences in different parts of the world that led to differences in social organization, that then led to certain societies developing particular technologies, guns, germs, and steel, that then let them invaded other countries across the world. And so this is a book that was very well received in the U.S. within popular culture. And the thing is, the reason why it was so well received, as a lot of anthropologists have noted, is that it confirms so many cultural assumptions and ideologies in the United States. it confirms this idea that colonialism is grounded in a kind of natural behavior, that people had the technology, and so naturally they do this. They naturally colonize other people. They naturally invade people and enslave people. And what that does, right, is it obscures the specific social and cultural systems that motivated European expansionism, colonial expansionism, as well as the particular social forms that we're talking about by creating these kinds of overgeneralized ideas. Often people will conflate warfare with the practice of colonization, or slavery in the sense of chattel slavery, the buying and purchasing of human beings, with other forms of slavery which are not premised upon the elimination of a person as a social being and reduction of them to private property. Which is all very complex, but which is to say, culture and history matter here, right? And part of what Guns, Germs, and Steel did is it located colonial inequalities and colonial violence within natural human nature, or it said it was a matter of human nature that ultimately stemmed from environmental processes. Basically saying it was no one's fault. White people, Europeans, colonists are not to blame. Now one of the problems with Jared Diamond's answer to Yali's question is he fundamentally misunderstood the question. He assumed in a way that reflects his own U.S. bourgeois culture, right, that Yali was jealous of all the cool stuff and technology that white people had, that white folks in the U.S. had. He coveted these things because these like material goods are just innately desirable. But that's actually not what Yali is asking, because if you look at Papua New Guinean cultural frameworks and cultural practices, one of the things that's really historically important in this part of the world is gift giving. And there's been these studies, right, of these massive circulations of goods as they move throughout the entire region, as they move not just through Papua New Guinea, but also through the broader chunk of the Pacific Ocean. And these objects are traded through these vast distances, and part of what's happening, right, is people are able to develop whole systems, cultural systems, where they're saying, I am a valuable person, and I can demonstrate that because look at these other people in these distant societies that show how much they value me as a person by giving me these really interesting gifts, which I can then give to other people to show them how much I care about them, right? So part of what this is about with gift giving is this idea that you show you value other people by giving them cargo, by giving them gifts. And through this process, cargo or gifts exchange throughout vast regions. And so we can rethink Yali's question, right, using a more anthropological, culturally relevant framework to say, it's not that Yali just coveted cool shit from white people. It's that he was asking, why are white people considered to be worth so much and black people are considered to be worth so little? This is the exact same question we see with Black Lives Matter, albeit in a very different context in a different part of the world. And so essentially, right, tying all of these things together, the point I want to make, right, is that we can talk about these ideas, the ways in which Papua New Guinea is represented as primitive, as backwards, as uncivilized, but those representations are actually part of a colonial ideology that shapes that has shaped and continues to shape issues like material violence, like policy, through economic practices like dispossession and globalization. And so how are these representations, this is the question we're engaging with, how are these representations of Papua New Guinea related to these older colonial ideologies of social evolutionism? And how do these frameworks then justify or legitimize social inequalities on a global level? So these are the discussion questions to guide your forum posts for the second part of this asynchronistic class. So I've given you these prompts if you're the kind of person who really does better with structure. But if you have something else you want to write about, something that came up in the lecture or the readings that are not encompassed by these questions, feel free to write about that instead. That's totally fine. And remember that you're supposed to write about, on the one hand, make a post that's your own response to the course material, and then respond to at least 2 of your peers' posts. All right? And I'll see you guys next class.